Hello, and welcome to another virtual author chat at the Poison Pen Bookstore. I'm John Charles, and our very special guest author today is Jennifer Deibel. Did I get that correct?
Deibel.
Deibel. Thank you for correcting me. Whose new book, The Lady of Galloway Manor, is just out this month. Before we begin our chat, I do want to pause briefly and let those listening in know that we have copies of Jennifer's new book on order. We also have our first book in stock, and we would be happy to hold copies for you or put them in the mail. Just give us a call or go online to the bookstore and we can get that set up for you. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Jennifer. Hello.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I'm delighted you could make it. Let's start first by having you tell us a little bit about yourself. Who was Jennifer before you became a writer?
Well, that's a loaded question. Well, I was born and raised in Arizona. I was actually born in a little town in northern Arizona called Williams. It's now
Oh,
famous for the grizzly, I forget what it's called now, Arizona.
yeah.
And I kind of grew up all over the states, and then my husband and I moved to Donegal, Ireland when we'd only been married a couple of years. We moved over there to study the culture, the language, the music. So we were there for 2 years, and then we came back and we lived in Texas for a few years while my husband was getting his master's degree, and then went back to Ireland and worked for an American-based travel company there for several years. Our son was born there. Um, and then we got to spend about a year and a half in Vienna, Austria. And then we've been back here in Arizona now for about almost 6 years, I think. And by day, I teach middle school English, and I'm a mom of three. And my husband and I have been married for almost 22 years.
Oh, that's wonderful. Now, I read somewhere that you had, in an interview, said to someone that living abroad helped make you a better writer. Can you kind of
Oh, for
expand
sure.
on that?
Sure. I think, I was kind of your stereotypical sheltered child growing up. I was in a very conservative family, which I'm grateful for. But because of financial restrictions and things, I wasn't able to be exposed to a whole lot of different points of view or life experiences. And so those almost 10 years total that we ended up spending overseas helped my worldview kind of shift a little bit and see things that had been kind of black and white to me had kind of now realized, wow, that might not be an absolute, situation or whatever. And so it helped me kind of see my own culture from a different perspective and see how that had shaped the way that I see the world, but then experiencing the world through their culture and their filter also helped me understand and kind of grew my empathy a little bit, and it helped me be able to sort of get in other people's shoes a little bit better than I had been, which helps immensely in writing other characters where you have to think like another person, and especially if they're completely opposite to your own personality. So I'm very grateful for that time that we had for many reasons, but it definitely um, strengthened me as a writer for sure.
Let's talk a little bit about your path to publication. I think it's fair to say, and correct me on these Irish names if I get them wrong, a dance in Donegal
Hmm.
was not something that happened overnight. It was kind of a long and arduous path. So can you tell us a little bit about writing your first book and seeing it into publication?
Sure. So I had been writing my whole life. I would spend hours as a kid writing in my diary or writing stories or making up plays or whatever. And then after our first 2 years in Donegal, we came back, and those 2 years were amazing and incredible, and probably two of the most difficult years of our lives, even now, because we were so alone, we were isolated, away from family, culture shock, all of that. And I found myself really needing a way to process what we had experienced. And one day, this idea came to me for a story about a teacher who moves to Ireland and what she goes through. And so I was expecting our first child at the time, so I started writing it, and then after she was born, it sat for a very, very, very long time, years, until we actually ended up moving back over to Ireland. And excuse me, I had heard about a new parenting website that was taking applications for contributors. So I applied and I was accepted to be a monthly contributor, and they recommended that I start my own blog. Because at that time, this was back in 2010. So, like, blogs were like the thing. So I
Mhm.
started my blog and I just started writing, and it reminded me how much I love writing. And so I picked up that story again. And it was an on again, off again thing for so many years. But that's when I really knew I needed to pursue this to the end, whether it ended up getting published or not. So I started writing it in 2004, 2005, and I finally finished it. I think it was 2017. And I got my agent later that year, and then we started pitching publishers in mid 2018, and then I signed my contract in the spring of 2019, and then it was published in the spring of 2021. So a lot of my friends do the NaNoWriMo, and I do NaNoWriDecade because it took about 15 years total.
Now, you mentioned a little bit about the protagonist. Just tell those listening in who might not be familiar with the book a little bit about what it covers.
So it's set in 1920. It starts off in Boston. Our heroine, Maura Doherty, lives there with her mom, who had immigrated from Ireland when she was a young adult. And Maura's mother passes away and gives Maura this sort of final call to go back to Ireland. And she had put her in as a replacement for the teacher who'd been there, since the world was created, basically. So
Mhm.
she goes over there. She wrestles with it at first. She's not sure she wants to go, but she decides that she needs to for her mom.
Mhm.
And when she gets over there, she realizes there's all these rumors surrounding her mother and why her mother had left. And there's threats against her. And she's finding all these little things around her that um, eventually kind of put her livelihood, but also her life in danger. So then she has to work to try to get to the bottom of what the rumor even is and how to clear her family name. And of course, along the way, she gets help from a crazy group of people. There may be a handsome Irish Thatcher in there who helps her out a little bit. Um, and it's kind of her journey of learning what home truly means, I think.
Now, that was your first book, and I think we can
Mhm.
also safely say that your experiences writing your second book were completely different, A Lady of Galway
Oh,
Manor.
yes, that book, that's my pandemic baby. I wrote the bulk of that book in June and July of 2021. Is
Mhm.
that right? Or 2020? 2020.
2020.
2020.
Yeah.
Um, at my dining room table. And so that was definitely like a sprint sort of feeling. But the experience of how the story came to me was also completely different. Whereas with A Dance in Donegal, I kind of would have these fits and spurts of inspiration or ideas. This whole story kind of came to me at once, and I couldn't get it on the page fast enough. So yeah, releasing your debut during a pandemic and then writing another one it's an experience for sure, but I'm grateful for it.
Tell us a little bit about the new book, A Lady of Galloway Manor.
So the lady of Galway Manor, her name is Annabeth de Lacy. It is also set in 1920 in Ireland, but it's in Galway instead of Donegal. So Donegal is far north part of the Republic of Ireland. Galway's right in the middle on the west coast. And at this time, there were still British landlords in charge of the parishes of the Republic of Ireland. They had not gained their full independence from Britain yet. So her father had just been assigned as the new landlord there. And he does not have any sons. He has two daughters. And so he sort of goes back and forth between treating Annabeth like a daughter, like a lady of the court, and also like the son that he wished that he could have. And so he allows her to do things that wouldn't always be considered proper for a lady of the court. And so because she's bored, there's no court for her to really be involved with. she manages to convince him to set up an apprenticeship for her with the makers of the Clutter Ring, which the ancestors are from that area. There's an area in Galway City called the Claddagh, and that's where the original creator of the ring was from. And his family to this day still run the Claddagh jeweler shop. And so I that whole story works its way through this story as well. But Annabeth then joins Stephen Jennings, who is the ancestor in the story, and he hates all things British. He doesn't believe in love. He's been burned too many times, and so he's trying to find a way to escape having to peddle this lie of love every day and have all these googly-eyed,
Couple.
over-the-top romantic couples come into the store, looking for this ring. So he has actually secured a job somewhere else, but he hasn't told his father yet when his father saddles him with this apprentice who's a British lady, no less. And so then they have to kind of work together, figure out how to work together. And they both she's sort of been told that they're God's gift to the Irish and that the Irish are these barbaric people that need saving. And she starts to see that maybe that's not really true. And Stephen has some of the same moments where he has to really sort of examine his beliefs about this group of people that, from his own experiences and from what he's been told, might not actually be the truth.
Mhm. For someone who might not know about is it Cloudo Ring?
Mhm.
Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I thought that was fascinating.
Sure. So the Clutter Ring was one of those things that I knew what it was, but I didn't realize I knew what it was. So it's a ring design that has a heart in the middle, and then there's two hands that hold the heart, and there's a crown on top. And it started with the Joyce family are the people who created it. I believe his first name is Richard. He was actually kidnapped back in the 16th century by Moorish pirates, and he was sold to a goldsmith there. And he spent years there working for this goldsmith, and he actually developed these amazing skills. But the whole time he spent pining for his true love that he had left behind in Ireland. And he came up with this design where the heart represents love, the hands represent friendship, and the crown represents loyalty. And it sort of was everything that he wanted for her put into this design. And so eventually there was this agreement between the king and wherever he had ended up at the time, and he was free to go. His goldsmith captor wanted him to stay on so much that he even offered his own daughter's hand in marriage to him to get him to stay, but he didn't want to. So he came back to Ireland all those years later. His true love had waited for him the whole time. So then he presented her with the ring, and the rest is history, as they say.
Now, both of your books have been written about Ireland and set in Ireland.
Mhm.
What is it about this country that appeals to you as a writer?
There's no shortage of stories. The Irish love story. They're sort of an oral people. Even their native language, Irish Gaelic, was an oral language up until about maybe 300 years ago. Someone attempted to try to write it down, and so I think their culture just embodies story, and it's magical. Anyone who's ever gone to Ireland, I've never heard anyone go, "Ugh,
Mhm.
Ireland." Everyone is like, "Oh my goodness, Ireland." It's just it gets in your soul, and I felt like my heart had always been born there, and I hadn't truly discovered it until I lived there. And so I want people to be able to experience the real Ireland, to get beyond Blarney and top of the morning and all that kind of stuff, and get to see how amazing the country and the people are, at the depth of who they are.
Let's talk a little bit about the research involved in writing books. Do you go to particular sources? I mean, especially in the case of the Gaelic language, do you have
Mhm.
other people that you rely on? Because there's a lot of details woven into your stories, and that
Yes.
must take you some time. So talk about researching your books.
Okay. So, having lived in both Donegal and in Galway, was invaluable to my research. It, I think, allows me to bring an authenticity because I've experienced what it smells like, what the weather feels like, what the food tastes like, what the brogue sounds like, all of that. So having spent almost a decade in that has sort of seeped in. We also spent that entire time studying the language.
Uh,
So when we left, our children were we lived in an area that was called the Gaeltacht, which is an area reserved for the language. It's most people's first language that live there. Our children in school were taught through Gaelic. So our kids actually never went to school in English until we moved back to the United States. So that helped. I still have, there's some Irish language websites, not Google Translate, but there are some Irish language websites that I'll go to make sure that I get the spelling right, because I learned how to speak it. I didn't really learn how to write it because
mm,
they don't really read, like, it's not a normal part of their daily life to read it, because it looks like your toddler sat down on the keyboard and just went like this. There's like not enough vowels and they change sounds and all that kind of stuff.
mm,
So I do draw a lot from places that we actually were. And then for other things, so in Galway Manor, they are set in a historically accurate place, but I do change a few details, so I can take some creative license. So there's um, a pub in the story called the King's Ransom, and it's inspired by the King's Head pub. So I would go to their website and they list their whole history of the building, because it's one of the oldest buildings in the country and all of that. So it kind of depends on, I try to go directly to the source to
mhm.
find their stories and their um, view of their history to sort of build my own on, if that makes sense.
It does, yeah. And let's expand and talk about your individual writing process. Can you tell us a little bit about, do you prefer to know things in advance? Do you kind of write just by the seat of your pants? I also found it interesting. I think you had said somewhere that initially you found it as a writer being, it was difficult for you to be tough on your characters and you had to learn how to really um, make their lives miserable, I
Yeah,
guess.
for sure. I would say, and I'm stealing this from another writer friend, I would say that I'm a planter. I'm
Okay.
sort of a cross between a plotter and a pantser. My first book definitely was almost all by the seat of my pants, and I only wrote when the muse struck. And once I had a contract, I didn't really have that luxury. And so I found that, you have to turn in a synopsis of the whole story before they say, yes, we like this story or not. So I have a rough idea of what's going to happen. And then I spend a lot of time going over scenes in my head. I know a lot of authors will make outlines, or they use note cards, or they do the snowflake method, or, there's all these things out there. I just sort of write in my head. And then when I sit down, then I put it out all on paper. So I would say it's definitely a mix of both plotting and just sort of winging it, because sometimes my characters don't like to play nice. There was a character that showed up about three-quarters of the way through my first book that I had no plans for, but he showed up and he caused all kind of trouble. And I think the story is probably the better for it. So um, but yeah, I felt like my characters at the beginning were kind of like my own kids. And so, you want what's best for your kids and you want to make life easy on them. But then I realized that makes a really boring story to read. So
Mhm.
I've had several readers reach out to me, being quite upset with me for some of the things that I've done done to my characters. So that actually makes me feel really good.
It should. It speaks to the credit of how strongly you evoke emotions in the reader if
Mm.
they're seeing them as real people. Um, as you look back now, when at the publishing process, at the writing process, at your journey, what do you wish you had known back when you first started as a writer that you know now?
Hmm. I think maybe just to appreciate the season that I was in.
Mhm.
I'm one of those people that I'm constantly like ready for the next stage. Okay, what's next? What's next? And so then I think a lot of the richness of the season that I'm currently in. And so I think I spent so much time dreaming about the day that someday hopefully would come, that I think if I had allowed myself to be a little bit more present, I could have learned some of the lessons along the way maybe a little bit sooner.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that would probably be the biggest one.
What kind of a relationship as an author do you have with social media? Do you find it helps you in your writing career? Do you sometimes curse it? Do you have particular platforms that you're more inclined to gravitate to? Talk about social media and its
Mm.
role.
I really enjoy social media. Most of the time, I think because we spent so much time out of the country, that it was really the main way that we could keep in contact with, our friends and family. And so it just sort of was natural once I started my blog, um, that that was sort of a natural outflow from that. And because I had my website and I was writing for magazines and websites and things like that for, almost 10 years before I was published, that also really helped because I had that base, that reader base already there that a lot of, debut authors don't always have if they just sort of have jumped into it. Um, and I do see it as a relationship connecting tool. I don't think of myself as like an influencer or trying to sell my books through social media. It's just sort of a way to continue the conversation, which I really enjoy. I would say I'm most active on Instagram. Um, I have a Twitter. I don't really use it anymore, and Facebook would be my close second. I do have a Facebook page, but Instagram is kind of where I hang out the most because I find it's the easiest place to build community, and the Bookstagram community especially is just so incredible and supportive. And I've really had nothing but positive experiences with it.
That's great. One of the other interesting things I had discovered about your background is at one point, I think you worked for a literary PR firm and you helped people who were interviewing authors write questions
I
for
did.
authors. Does that come in handy now that you're on the other side of the table, or?
I feel like it should, but when it comes to my own books, I find it's kind of like everyone knows how to be a parent till they have their own kid, and then suddenly they don't know anything. That's kind of how I feel. I have a hard time being more objective about it, about my own books. So sometimes I do feel a little bit pressure on myself, like, come on, Jen, you should know, like this should be easy for you. This was your job. But I think I'm sometimes just a little bit too close to my own stuff for it to be super handy.
Yeah. What advice with your PR hat on would you give to other authors, would you say?
I would say don't be afraid of social media. A lot of writers are extreme introverts, which is why writing suits them so well. And they're like, well, I don't want to be full of myself. I don't want to put myself out there. I don't want to, market me.
Mhm.
Um, and I would encourage them, don't look at it that way. Look at it like you're building a relationship with your readers, with people who are like-minded, who enjoy what you write and what you enjoy reading. And I would just encourage them to don't be afraid to just put it out there and be yourself, and work on building that community, both with other writers and with your kind of ideal readers, and look at ways that you can serve them to fill a need that they have. So you're not just me, this is my stuff, but you can help other authors, you can fill a need for your readers somehow. And then it becomes more natural and organic rather than feeling so forced and kind of icky.
Now let's take a turn now to your life as a reader. What kind of books do you enjoy? Has there been things recently in the last year that you like to share with other readers?
Um, Typically, I gravitate towards historical romance, which is what I write, which I love. But I have found when I'm writing, I cannot read that genre because then it like affects my own writing voice a little bit too much. So I've branched out. I've recently discovered romantic suspense, which
Yeah.
I really, really enjoy. Natalie Walters is an author that I had known on social media for a long time, but I hadn't read any of her books yet. And I started reading her about a year ago, and I really enjoy her. Jamie Jo Wright is another one. She does like time slip suspense. Um, and her books are creepy as all get out, which is not normally something that I
Mm.
enjoy, but she does it so masterfully, and it always sort of wraps up so beautifully. So I enjoy those are two kind of like new to me type branching out of my own typical genre that I've really enjoyed.
What about Nora Roberts and her Irish books? Have you read
I
those?
have read a couple of hers. I find it really interesting. I read P.S. I Love You.
Oh,
Is that Nora Roberts?
no,
I think
that's
that's Nora Roberts.
Cecilia Ahern, I think.
Yeah, that's Cecilia Ahern.
Ahern.
Um, I am also one of those people that never know like names. So if
Mhm.
someone be like, "Don't you love that new so and so song?" I'm like, "I don't know." And then they play it. I'm like, "Oh yeah, I know
Yeah.
that song." Yeah, I find it really fascinating. I especially enjoy reading from Irish authors because I
Oh,
feel like it also helps me get their perspective and sort
yes.
of crack into that Irish worldview a little bit more.
Mhm.
Because no matter how long I live there, I'm never going to be Irish, and so I do enjoy that sort of the way they view the world. And there's always sort of a dark layer underneath all of it, which is really
Mhm.
fascinating to kind of dig into.
What's next for you as an author? Can you share anything with us?
I just submitted the day before my latest book just launched. I submitted the manuscript for my third book. It's another standalone.
Oh,
This one's taking us back to Donegal, set in 1935, and it title's not official yet or anything, but it's sort of like um, Cinderella meets sort of mysterious. So it's set in a place just outside of Letterkenny called Ballymacool, and it's a boarding house, and it follows the story of this girl who's been orphaned, and she's like the lowest scullery maid in the house, and she discovers this treasure sort of thing that she finds, and so she's having to work to sort of figure out what this is and does it have a connection to her, or what her kind of purpose is. 'Cause she always feels like she's been meant for something more, but she has no way to pursue that. She just sort of feels stuck and alone. So it's kind of her search for identity. So there's a lot of exploration of what is identity, what does that mean, how do you know who you are, not just what your station is in life.
fascinating. You're kind of creeping up in time, so you've gone from the 1920s into the 1930s now. Do you ever
Yes.
do you ever think about possibly the World War II in an Irish story, or is that too challenging?
I have thought about it. I was actually thinking about some story ideas, and there's lots of really crazy stories about ships that were torpedoed off the west coast of Ireland during World War II and World War One. So I've thought about it, but I also thought about throwing it even farther back into the earlier 1900s or even the
Oh,
1800s, because um, I feel like that's just a really fascinating time frame to explore, because Ireland in 1935, it seems like it should be fairly modern, but
mm,
especially in Donegal, there were a lot of places that still didn't have electricity. A lot of people still didn't have cars, and so it it's hard sometimes to make it authentic to the time period
mhm.
to someone who doesn't understand like that they didn't have
Modern.
all those things at that time. Yeah.
Well, I guess with Ireland, you're really spoiled for choices when it comes to historical time periods.
Yes, absolutely.
Um, how can readers learn more about you and your books? Do you have a website?
I do. The website is sort of my one-stop shop, and it's just jenniferdeibel.com, and Deibel is Deibel. Nice, good German name.
Mm.
And there's all the information about my books, links to my social media. They can sign up for my newsletter there, which I typically send out about once a month, sometimes once every other month, with just updates and what I'm reading and all that kind of good stuff.
Well, I can't believe we're almost out of time. You've just
I
flown by with
know.
such a fascinating interview. Jennifer, before we leave, I do want to let those listening in, Jennifer's books are A Dance in Donegal
Hmm.
and A Lady of Galloway Manor. We do have copies of one in stock. The other is on order at the Poison Pen. Feel free to give us a call or go online. We'll hold them for you. I want to thank Jennifer for taking time to visit with us today, and I'm looking forward to your third book. It sounds absolutely marvelous.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed chatting with you today.
And thank everyone for listening in to another virtual author chat at the Poison Pen.
Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.